Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for the Survey and Spatial webinar that's being presented by our independent economist, Tony Alexander. For those of you who are online, if you have any questions at all for Tony, please pop those into the Slido box, and I will read those out to Tony at the end of Tony's presentation, and he will answer them for you. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy this presentation from Tony. And please don't forget to send through your any questions you may have. So thank you, Tony. Over to you.
All right. Okay. Look, thanks very much, Jenny, and thanks to everybody sitting online there. I'm going to speak for maybe 20 minutes or so, and then we'll just open it up for Q&A if any come through. If it looks like none are coming through, I'll speak for the full 30 minutes, and we'll just see how we go. Basically, when these annual budgets come along, we economists get asked a whole range of questions, and some, if we're silly enough, we try and answer some of the detailed stuff regarding what do you really think is the impact on Maori health of this government initiative, or of primary education, early childcare sector. How's it going to be affected? Well, of course, we are macroeconomists, and we have to be careful not to try and sound insightful in some of these very specialised areas where intensity of interest in what the government does is obviously extremely high. But I cannot offer you insight into what the impact of equity pay plans is likely to be on the quality of early childcare, for instance, or exactly whether the healthcare reforms are going to radically alter outcomes in the sector. All I can note is that this was pretty much a long-term focused budget from the government there, looking obviously at health and where things are going there. So restructuring is underway. Infrastructure, very long term. So obviously very good for people generally involved in the infrastructure sector, above ground, below ground, through the ground, etc. And the other area, climate change as well. Also, of course, of intense interest to people involved in green energy technologies, the electric vehicle industry, all that sort of stuff. So good with a long-term focus there, and that's what the government had emphasised ahead of the budget. It's got a long-term focus in there, but they did have to recognise that people generally, households, are under some extreme pressure from the soaring cost of living. A lot of people haven't seen inflation, cost of living change exceeding their wages growth for a great number of years. Between 2011 and 2019, inflation in New Zealand averaged only 1.2% per annum. And for the past 20 years, on average, wages have grown 2% more than inflation per annum on average. So this is an unusual situation for many people. And the government's initiatives there, extending by 2 months half-price public fare, the 25 cents petrol levy excise discount, and the $350 for about 2.1 million people. They're going to provide some short-term relief out there, but of course it's going to be a problem once these things end. How's the government going to come out and say, well, actually, we're putting the price of petrol up on you by 25 cents? And of course, the longer they leave it, if they extend it again, you start to get into election year thinking out there as well. So they should never have cut the petrol price by 25 cents. The lesson of the 1970s was those countries which let through into their economy straight away the quadrupling of oil prices from 1973-74 had better economic outcomes than those that tried to insulate their economies, such as New Zealand did back at the time. There were some positive factors in there for the business sector, but more along the lines of if you are a cabinet minister and they ask you, oh, minister, seriously, was there anything in there for the business sector? You can say, yes, we are setting up some industry transformation plans, and so that sounds like a good thing for coordination. It's really not going to make any difference to this economic cycle. Same thing for the $100 million growth fund. That sounds good. The biggest problem for businesses is not a shortage of capital. It's a shortage of willingness to take in outside capital, and of course a shortage of staff, raw materials, the whole supply chain functioning, etc. And in that regard, there was nothing in this budget which addresses the big concerns of the business sector, being the shortage of staff, being the not functioning properly of the supply chains, rising borrowing costs out there, compliance issues, etc. But at least there were some token gestures in that regard. And the apprenticeship scheme extension for a year, that is a positive development, but I expect it to make pretty much no dent in one of the negative factors suppressing our growth for the next couple of years in New Zealand, which of course is going to be a brain drain of many young people across to Australia. when you have the cost of living rising strongly in New Zealand, high house prices, low wages growth, wages far lower than overseas, and people haven't been cooped up one way or another for a couple of years, I think it seems pretty reasonable to expect a lot of the Kiwis who have ridden out the pandemic in New Zealand will be leaving, and a lot of those of us who have been here for many years will choose to go overseas. As historically we have done at least once a generation, us Kiwis will say to ourselves, I'm going to Australia for 3 to 5 years, I'll make a nest egg, and then I'll come back. There's 650,000 of us in Australia. As a rule, we don't come back. And I would not expect that the 1 million in total already overseas are going to be coming back, given the strong labour markets overseas and the fact that if we are in Australia, if we're in London, Ontario, wherever, there's 99% chance we are there for income reasons. And I don't expect a great number of people back to New Zealand. So when I look at the next couple of years, we are looking at a slowdown in our pace of growth. Yes, there's some post-COVID ending of lockdown improvements in activity out there for the hospitality sector. But even there, of course, with the rising cost of living, a lot of people are going to look for savings by pulling back on discretionary spending. The first port of call is going to be eating out and drinking out. So not necessarily so good for the hospitality sector there. But there's also something else or a few things happening which will generally suppress consumer spending going forward, which will generally keep a bit of restructuring undergoing in the retail sector. And that is that you and I in the past 2 years have binged like no sane person ever expected when the pandemic came along, on spas, electric vehicles, cars, home renovations, couches, all these sort of things. We've focused on doing up our home nests. Now we don't need another spa for the next 3 to 4 decades. We don't need another couch for another 1 or 2 decades. And so we're going to be facing quite a decline in our purchases of those durable goods over the next 2 to 3 years. And for retailers and manufacturers of such out there, if you've had booms in sales for the past 2 years, one had better be allowing for some weakness coming ahead, because there's quite a downward cycle coming along there. And there's also negative pressure on household spending from interest rates going up. So some people are having to pay more as their fixed rates mature for their mortgage payments. I don't have a great concern about house prices plummeting away when somebody says, I was paying 2.19%, now I'm paying 4.5 or 5%. My interest costs have doubled. Yeah, but the bank lent them the money, having sat down, talked with them, and figured out that the borrower, could handle maybe 6.5% test interest rate. What's going to happen is that people will continue to service their mortgages pretty well, but they are going to have to cut back in spending on a great number of other areas. Also, some household spending cutback coming along because asset prices are falling. So paper wealth is going down. People seeing share prices falling, house prices are pulling back. And so this is sort of a key element out there in that consumer spending, I think, is going to go through a relatively weak phase for the next couple of years. And the key point to note here is this is good when it comes to monetary policy. The Reserve Bank is raising interest rates in order to fight inflation. The objective they have in raising interest rates is that consumer spending will be crunched. You and I will pull back on buying stuff. Well, we are. I've got a monthly spending plan survey, and on average for each month in the 18 months leading up to December last year, a net 25% of you and I would say, I'm going to buy more stuff in the next 3 to 6 months. In the first survey for this year in February, a net 11% of us said, I'm going to buy less stuff. Same results for March and April. And the most recent survey 2 weeks ago, a net 20% of us said, I'm going to buy less stuff. I can actually see the crunch in consumer spending is already happening out there. And that's why I don't think the Reserve Bank is going to have to come out and scare the bejeebers out of people, even as inflation goes down at uncertain speed the rest of this year and through 2023. Because the thing they want to see happening, I think, is already comfortably happening out there. Wages growth, it's going to pick up. I don't think we're going to hit the 6%, which Treasury have got in their economic forecast there. And my interest rate outlook is I'm still picking that the peak in the official cash rate, 1.5% at the moment, will be 3%. That's possibly the lowest peak out there. Most others are sitting around 3.5%, but we'll just have to see how things go. I can see a lot of negative factors for our economy in the very near future. And like I say, I can see a lot of the spending, the restraint the Reserve Bank wants is underway. The pursuit in China of a COVID management strategy of eradication is likely to keep supply chains interrupted for the entirety of the rest of this year through well into 2023. So building materials coming from there, consumer products, intermediary products, generally, it's likely those flows are going to remain relatively interrupted, unfortunately, because of COVID's the COVID strategy still being pursued in China. And of course, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we've seen a spike in international energy prices, and we're looking at some food prices, commodity prices rising strongly generally, and major concerns about people's access to food in less developed economies around the world in particular. And we're looking at a slowdown in world growth. And normally that would lead me to be saying, well, that doesn't sound like it's good for commodity prices. Well, actually, New Zealand's export prices on average are 32% higher than they were at the end of 2019. And as we see grain prices in particular going up, this is the sort of thing that tends to put upward pressure on New Zealand's food prices in particular. So, you know, I don't have a bad outlook for our pastoral sector, fishing, forestry overall. Their activity levels will provide some good support for the regions, subject to weather, climate conditions, and what it means, for instance, with the grass growth and the Waikato, as we've been learning, for instance, in the news in the past few days. There are some insulating factors for our economy as we experience a slowdown, because that's what the Reserve Bank's aiming for, and because that's what's happening around the rest of the world. Some of the factors insulating things would be high job security. The unemployment rate's 3.2%. Treasury predict 4.8%. I think that's too pessimistic. I don't think there are going to be all that many firms looking to actively lay off staff in the coming year. I mean, that's happening all the time, that you do get layoffs, but they're being matched by people hiring, and there's a massive shortage of staff at the moment. High job security will leave good ability to service mortgages in place. It will also mean the banks feel reasonably happy about their lending, and so mortgagee sales, I think, are going to be reasonably light this cycle, even though the fall in house prices is relatively strong in a correction from absurdly high levels in the second half of last year. Another insulating factor is that normally when an economy weakens, businesses go, the economy's weakening, I'd better cut my inventories because maybe no one's going to buy my stuff. Businesses around the planet are trying to build up their inventories instead because of the supply chain disruptions. So a thing that tends to aggravate your downward cycle, I don't think is much going to be in operation this time around. And I anticipate continued strong demand for existing and construction of new warehouses and logistics facilities around the country as well. Foreign tourists returning second half of this year, more especially next year. Winter for the Australians coming across and skiing. Foreign students from next year coming through, so that's a positive. House building, this is interesting. I expect quite a wave of developers failing. We've had a lot of inexperienced, undercapitalized, over-optimistic people become property developers. They've not done it before. They are facing a pullback in demand out there. Ability to get pre-sales has been compromised as buyers can see problems in terms of delivery in a timely manner. Everybody's going to be reading those stories about the shortages of gypboard continuing pretty much until the factory opens, at least in Tauranga of next year. It's going to cause, I think, a number of buyers to increasingly start stepping back. Failure to get pre-sales, and for developers running a financing model of I pay for this stuff by selling stuff yet to be built over here, that financing model is going to cause, I think, a few problems out there. And of course, the uniqueness of the shortage of staff and building materials, you know, it risks catching out the most experienced developers out there, as we've already seen with, I think, Condev is the name across in Australia, with their major projects as a builder underway across on the Gold Coast and other places as well. So I think there is some weeding out to come in the residential property development sector. But to a great degree, house building, it's still going to be strong in New Zealand for a great number of years. At a minimum, the government's going to be an active buyer, builder, financing, building of properties for a number of years. And a key reason there is in the OECD, on average, social housing, state housing stock forms about 8% of the total housing stock. In New Zealand, 4% if you're lucky. there's catch-up social housing construction being required in New Zealand. So Kāinga Ora, I'd expect them to be still a pretty strong facilitator of a lot of construction, providing a good chunk of pre-sales for many developments for a number of years, quite frankly, in New Zealand. And stuff which might get built at the moment, maybe it doesn't get consented, it gets delayed. And so what would otherwise have been a boom and bust cycle, the real boom can't happen because the resources aren't there. That sort of activity is dumped into the weaker period over, 2024, 2025. But I think we're probably close to peak levels of construction, but not a big bucketing off. It's more going to be some financial issues for some of the stretched, challenged property developers out there. Staff shortages, these are going to continue. I cannot see a great alleviation there, especially as the government is looking at pretty much restricting migration if possible. They have taken the view, well, strong growth in New Zealand since 1992, deregulated labour market, and yet even with unemployment rate at 3.2% now, 3.4% 2007, you're still looking at some fairly bad outcomes for sections of society in terms of health, education, incomes, workforce connectivity, and of course wages growth for some as well. And so they'll form the belief that maybe it would be good, in fact, if we did keep the pressure on New Zealand businesses to hire people, train them up, teach them how to read, write and count, take a risk, all that sort of thing, rather than simply import people from overseas. And that's sort of where I want to finish up here with my overriding comment now. It's been this way for 18 months. And it was like this for a number of years leading into the pandemic as well. We are a capacity constrained economy. We are less and less an economy constrained by not enough people to buy the milk powder, to buy the red meat, the salmon, the forest products, etc. We're constrained by supply chain problems, which will eventually alleviate, but especially a shortage of labour. And the last thing you want to do as a business is sign up to supply a whole lot of product in the next 5 years that you can't deliver because you cannot get the supply chains in order. You cannot get the properties to use for your head office, new distribution centres, or you cannot get the staff. You have to run your business by figuring out what resources can I command for the next few years, bring in from overseas, keep in New Zealand or whatever, work that out. And then the next question is, does that mean I can even sustain my current level of output? Or if you can, what growth will that allow me to sustain over the next few years? You've got to do things sort of ass about face compared with what we've done for the past 2 centuries. Sign up customers, then hire people, get premises, etc. It's a different focus for your business. And my final comment that I'll just make here would be, so what do you do in that sort of situation once you've actually done that exercise on what I can command? You've then got to rank all of your goods and services you produce by their profitability, and you might need to cut out the bottom 20% of them. All your production processes by most effective, highest productivity, same process, distribution centres, all those sorts of things, and specific clients as well. Who do you get the most money from? Who the least? Well, in the capacity constrained environment, you start chopping out those that deliver you the least profitability over time. So for me, the budget doesn't fundamentally change my concerns about us still having a capacity constrained economy overall. It doesn't change my outlook for inflation, interest rates, exchange rate, labour market, supply chain problems, etc. And just for the record, the fiscal numbers by the government, have no concerns there, and there's not a single credit rating agency or institutional fund manager applying any pressure on the New Zealand government to embrace fiscal austerity in order to get the accounts under control. New Zealand government accounts look fantastic compared with most other countries. So I'll knock it on the head there, Jenny, and we'll just see if anyone has any questions. Oh, no questions coming through. If you want to ask a question, go for it, but I'll make some up. So, Tony, if you were a borrower at the moment, what would you look at doing? I mean, we've seen the likes of the 1-year fixed mortgage rate go from the candy rate of 2.19%. I tried to encourage people not to take a year and a half ago. It now sits at 4.5%. The 5-year rate, well, it used to be at 2.99% for 5 years, and I jumped up and down like an idiot saying I would lock in at that rate. Hardly anyone did. A few people have. I've had emails saying thank you for saying that back at the time. The 5-year now is 5.79% is the best you'd get. 6 months ago, 3/4 of people were largely fixing for about 3 years. Now it's around 2 years is the preferred term. And if I were borrowing to finance my home, either a new purchase at the moment, or I'm coming up for refinancing, refixing, then I would probably fix 2 years as well. But there's a point maybe late this year, first half of 2023, where I would say, and people are going to go, what the hell is he talking about? I would take the pain of fixing 1 year, even though when I start saying that, that 1 year rate may well be the highest of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 year interest rates out there. And that'll be because if the 1 year's here and the 5 years here, the yield curve sloping downward, it's telling us something. It says the markets expect weaker economy, which will reduce inflation and interest rates will fall. And so from late this year, you should expect the focus of interest rate discussions to switch from, I wonder how high the cash rate goes and how long it stays up there, to, I wonder when interest rates start coming down. How fast will they come down? What will the new low point be? No, not the foggiest really for that last one there, but there'll be a change in that discussion a little bit further out. So I'd probably fix for 2 years there at the moment if I were a borrower. If I were looking to buy a house, would I still be looking to do so at the moment? Well, probably yes, especially as a young buyer. The key problem for young buyers for years has been too much competition coming through from investors. The investors are not selling. There is zero evidence of a wave of investors looking to sell, and there will not be a wave, but the investor buyers have stood back ever since March 23 last year with the tax changes through there. For the young buyers, my advice is don't try and find a bargain. Don't focus on, I'm going to wait until prices fall a bit further, but go back to the list of desired attributes in my first property that a person would have drawn up 6, 12, 18 months ago, and uncross all the ones you've crossed out and start looking for those desired attributes again, because listings are 70% higher than a year earlier. And it's not like there's a lot of sellers coming forward. It's more that other buyers have stepped back. So I still would be an active purchaser. And if I was looking to get something built, I would still go ahead with it, but I would extend my timetable, I guess, for realistically getting it done. And I would look to greater investigation of who's looking to build the place for me. Aside from consumers tightening their belts, what will cause inflation to fall over the next 6 to 12 months? Easy. Absence of another surge in energy prices. So the energy prices have gone up. A lot of these costs have already fed through to us as consumers into the business sector. And unless you get that happen again and the oil prices go to $150 a barrel, which some people think they will, but I don't, then you don't get that extra surge to inflation. So the absence of the one-off increases, because clearly there's a lot of one-off stuff which is running through here to account for central banks going from worries about deflation post-global finance crisis GFC environment to worries about inflation. This period of high inflation will pass. So that's what I would expect to be happening out there. I also don't believe a wage price spiral is coming along. I think a lot of people are agitating for higher wages. The employers simply can't afford to give them. And that, of course, will mean wages don't go up necessarily all that much. But those people will look to get the higher wages across in Australia. Those with the get up and go are going to get up and leave. So whatever labour supply problem you've got at the moment, you should expect it to get worse out there. Do you consider there will be an oversupply in housing? Okay, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Oversupply of development land, I would suggest that's probably where the greatest price weakness lies. I think people haven't sort of figured out the economics on this one. While national policy statement on urban development from August, was that 2020, does free up for intensification, greater land. So towards the centre of a city, the 6 stories you can build without councils preventing it, within walking distance of commercial centres, major bus lines, etc. The greater intensification does increase the potential prices of those bits of land. But for the rest of it, there is more of it available. There is an increase in the supply of land where you can build 3 stories and the council can't do a damn thing about it, or the neighbours by and large. So the economics of that suggest to me, for a lot of the development land out there, actually the price pressure is now downward. And there's probably been over purchasing. If you couldn't buy a new house because you wanted to ride capital gain upward, you might have bought some spec sections. Some of them will be coming back on the market, I would suggest. Oversupply, no, there won't be an oversupply, but there will be talk of oversupply in terms of who's going to buy all these townhouses in Auckland, people are going to say. Well, I do think the buyers are out there. A lot of these ones are well located, good quality production, quite frankly. But the talk of oversupply will contribute to buyers going, I'm going to stand back and wait to see what happens. You see, that's why I'd stay active in the market. Warren Buffett walking the other way from where everybody is going. I wouldn't expect a bargain, but I'd expect to be able to choose the cream from the crop, the pick of the litter, as it were. Of more interest actually in the regions. Auckland, big shortage, prices have risen to reflect that. In the regions, there's been a surge in population growth for 2 years as people have decided, well, I was going to leave Auckland cash up in 2024 was the plan for myself and my wife. But what the hell, we might be dead tomorrow. Let's move to Havelock North now. People have moved to the regions over the past 2 years. They're already there. They were going to move next year and the year after. So I think there's a little bit of internal migration slowdown. And so if there is actual physical oversupply of, these places are sitting on the market for 4 times longer than normal, I'd suggest it's going to be in the regions, not really in Auckland. The perception, a lot of it initially will be Auckland of who's going to lose the most people for the brain drain, Auckland. But eventually the migrants coming back the other way, it'll re-establish Auckland as having strong population growth. But technically, as long as prices can adjust, there is, just to piss you off here, technically there is never an oversupply or shortage in the housing market. It's simply a period of prices rising strongly or falling strongly. What advice would be to government to alleviate the supply constraints in building materials? Oh, yeah. You should have seen what hit the fan about 7 years ago when I was writing about housing, and I made a list of, I think it was 5 or 7 things that I would do to try and speed up house construction and home affordability in New Zealand. I can't remember what all of them were. I think there was some anti-investor stuff in there. But one of them was I would set up a government SOE to specifically boost the supply of building materials, and in particular sourcing of materials from overseas. So not so much a focus on setting up the government's own jibboard producing plant or plasterboard plant in New Zealand, but sourcing more from overseas, providing greater competition to the 2 major suppliers in New Zealand. Now, governments in New Zealand, you're simply not going to have that happen. It's like, is the government going to create its own supermarket chain? I guess they'd look for insights on that on the states chains in Poland and the Soviet Republic from back in the day, pre-1991. So no, I don't think there's anything the government can realistically do. They should have, I think, taken some moves a few years earlier to provide at least some alternative supply chains for people. No, I think we're going to be stuck with this for a while, because we've got to remember, around the world, governments have looked to stimulate their economies of, there's a downturn in my economy for whatever reason. How can I offset the impact on the economy? The answer, number one answer, is always construction sector. Let's dig a hole. Let's make a tunnel. Let's stimulate house construction. So house construction demand is pretty strong around the world, following the low interest rates, etc. Now, maybe 3 to 5 years down the track, there could be an oversupply of building materials. Well, that's not really relevant for most people at the moment. So, sorry, I think the building materials problem is going to continue. And no, I don't think realistically there is anything the government could do about that. They should have maybe taken some moves early on instead of just blindly pursuing the Kiwi builders, somehow some silver bullet answer to it, or let's ban foreign buyers. Prices in New Zealand have gone through the roof since the foreign buyers were banned from 2018, that time period. I'm just going to scroll down in case there's anything here. Nothing more there at the moment. If you have got another question, whack it through there. But Jenny, pass back to yourself.
Great. Thank you, Tony. And thank you so much to our survey and spatial members who have logged in this afternoon and listened to Tony. And thanks also for feeding through these questions that you had for Tony. It doesn't look like there's any more questions coming through, so we will wrap up this webinar for this afternoon. So thank you all for joining us. And once again, Tony, thank you. And we look forward to hearing from you at our 2022 conference in August. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, Jenny. Looking forward to being back on the conference circuit, I can tell you. So webinars fine, but physically speaking, really looking forward to it. So thanks very much for having us, and ta-da, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.